You're listening to the Raising Family Podcast with your hosts, David Steele and Linda Hill. Brought to you by the familyproclamation.org.
Hello and welcome to the Raising Family Podcast. I'm David Steele, your co-host, along with Linda Hill. And today we have Brent Andrewsen again on here with us. If you've listened to one of our other episodes where we had him on, it was a great time and we love having him on. He brings a unique and poignant perspective to some of these issues. So I'll give a quick introduction in case you haven't listened to the other episode with Brent. He is chairman of the board and shareholder at Kirton McKonkie, a law firm here in Utah. He deals a lot with estate planning and probate and trust administration, gift taxation, tax-exempt organizations, and has sat on the boards of various charitable organizations over the years. And so we're super grateful to have him on today, and we're talking today about the 8th paragraph in the proclamation. Really the latter half of the 8th paragraph. And so I'll read that, and then we'll just dive right in. So thanks for being here with us, Brent.
Thank you.
And so that says, further, we warn that the disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, communities, and nations the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets. It's kind of a heavy one there.
It is a heavy one. And in your line of work as an attorney, I know you have said you deal a lot in family law. And we're sure that you have some interesting perspectives on the calamities. And I'm sure you see a lot of the fallout of the disintegration of the family.
Yeah, for sure.
So why don't you share some of that with us?
So thankfully, I don't do a ton in what we would often call family law, which is dealing with marriage and divorce and custody. That was one of the areas when I was looking to be a lawyer, I eliminated fairly quickly because it's not a very pleasant area to be. What I have found, though, there's quite an intersection between family law and estate planning and probate and trust administration. And I think one of my mentors said it best, and he said it in the context of doing tax planning or good estate planning, but I think it has some relevance to what we're talking about here. He said all the best planning in the world cannot make a dysfunctional family functional, but poor planning or no planning can render an otherwise functional family dysfunctional rather quickly. And I think although that has more of a technical connotation, I have seen a lot more dysfunctional families than I think I thought I would. And you do see the breakdown of the family, the disintegration of the family affecting individuals and families and communities because the breakdown of the family, it all starts with families. And when I help someone do an estate plan and it's a third marriage and they've got children from all three marriages and they're trying to sort out what's going to happen and none of the kids like each other because they have different moms or different dads, depending on what the case may be, it really creates an interesting dynamic that's difficult. And so that's just one narrow context. The other, I think I'll just mention quickly too, I do a lot of nonprofit law. And one of the realizations I've had over the years is there's a need for nonprofits to solve societal problems because we've become much less capable of solving them for ourselves. And if families and communities gather together and fix the problems within their families, within the organizational structures that naturally used to exist, we wouldn't have the need to go create new organizations and try to bring people together and do fundraising around those sorts of things because the families usually took care of what we're seeing charities needing to take care of, or the government in some cases. So I've definitely seen the breakdown of the family affect people and communities through my line of work for sure.
Yeah. And it's interesting. In thinking about this paragraph, I know this says that the disintegration of the family will bring about those calamities, but it almost seems like in addition to maybe some of these giant calamities that we may think of as happening, just the disintegration of the family can be in and of itself a calamity for the people that are experiencing it. And that's a really interesting thing that came to mind when you were speaking about that.
we sometimes lose sight of the fact that when we talk about society, we're talking about the individuals that comprise that society, and what maybe doesn't start out as a large nationwide calamity is for somebody.
Right.
And again, I've watched family members or friends go through broken families, and it's hard. And again, there are all sorts of reasons for it and individual circumstances, but it's something that you don't wish on anyone. The one thing I remember from Psych 101 when I was a freshman at BYU was we got to the section where it talked about traumatic human experiences. And the thing that stood out to me was that the most traumatic, at least then through a survey of people who'd gone through traumatic experiences, the most traumatic experience was divorce. Not death of a loved one, not a traumatic injury, not all sorts of, when you looked at the list of things that were on that list,
There's a lot. Yeah.
I couldn't believe that divorce was number one.
Wow.
Now, years later, having some experience under my belt and being an adult and having been married for 26 years, I could see why it ranks so highly. But when we think about that and we see how prevalent that is, how prevalent the destruction or disintegration of families, if we talk about it on an individual family context, happens. I don't know what the statistic is about how many divorces are filed on a daily basis here in the United States, but it's far higher than it ought to be. And I do think it comes back to these warnings that are in the Family Proclamation. I think that if we look larger than just the individual families now and talk about it conceptually, the disintegration of the family as viewed as the fundamental unit of society, I think we're kind of just about there.
Yeah.
People get offended if you talk about the family and you mean mom and a dad and kids.
Right.
And you look at that and say, okay, so in some ways, societally, we've disintegrated what the traditional family is. And now I think if we looked around us, we'd see all sorts of other societal calamities that are very troubling to all of us, while also simultaneously being troubling to those individuals who are affected by it.
You know, one thing I have noticed recently when my kids were in elementary school, they're all, graduating college now. At the school we would have like dads and donuts on a Tuesday. So the dads could bring their kids in and have donuts and, or moms and muffins or just something, before school to have just a little bonding activity for like a mother-child or father-child things, daddy-daughter dances. Those I have noticed they have all gone away because people are so
gender connotation.
Right. And I understand that Nancy Pelosi just passed a law that we can't use gender terms. Can you expound on that?
What I understand, it was they put forth a rule for House protocol as they're discussing bills and dealing with issues within the House of Representatives, that they banned the use of gendered terms. And what I read, I haven't read the whole rule, but a couple articles I read about it said that the examples they gave were mother, father, son, daughter.
Oh my goodness.
Which is just, again, I think it speaks to specifically this disintegration conceptually that we have as the family being a fundamental unit for society.
Right.
And becoming this offensive thing that we literally can't even mention or talk about because it's so offensive.
Yeah. So that's a great example of how, laws or rules can affect the family and the disintegration of the family. And so maybe in discussing laws, maybe we can talk a little bit about the Equality Act, which has been around since 2010, was put through in the House in 2010. And we don't expect you to be an expert. You don't probably spend all of your spare time reading up on everything that goes through the government.
They don't even have that much time. Remember, they pass laws so you can read them.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, what it would be to be them. Wouldn't that be so fun? So maybe just from what you do know about the Equality Act, how can something like that, maybe just briefly explain what you do know about it,
Sure.
and then how can that add to the disintegration of the family?
Good question. The Equality Act is a bill that has been around, as you mentioned, for a while, that essentially would amend the Civil Rights Act, among a couple of other things, but to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in virtually every area, employment, housing, public accommodations, public education, federal funding, credit, the jury system, etc. And when you look at that, we have such a broad public society. You'll see the impact of a law like the Equality Act when you look at the Baker case out of Colorado.
Right, the cake.
Everything essentially becomes a public accommodation. And so if a law like this passes, it significantly alters how we go about our business. And I think more fundamentally, the Equality Act doesn't have built in, as a matter of fact, it intentionally doesn't provide some of the religious protections that used to exist that allowed people of religious organizations and people of religious conscience to follow the dictates of their conscience or their religious convictions. And in the context of sexual orientation and gender identity, those sorts of things have deep religious significance for some. For our religion, for instance, I think the word chastity is mentioned several times or a couple times in the Family Proclamation, and our law of chastity has very defined and only allows sexual activity between husband and wife, lawfully married according to God's law. And so passing something like this would significantly affect how churches could go about teaching marriage and family, how institutions that aren't churches, but maybe just an educational institution, maybe one controlled by church, maybe one that's just loosely affiliated with a church, a Catholic university. They're usually not controlled by the Catholic Church. They have an affiliation. Something like the Equality Act would significantly affect how they would go about fulfilling their mission as it relates to these family-oriented issues. Think about public schools. How do you even have books or records or things that talk about family in the traditional way, if anything that shows differences between sexual orientation or gender identity are acts of discrimination?
Wow. Yeah, the ramifications are very extensive.
Yeah, wow. You mentioned dads and donuts already kind of going the way of the dodo. They'll be prohibited if you pass something like this.
Wow.
So let's take this to an extreme case. Could potentially, because again, we talked about unintended consequences. With every law and every rule that is ever made for a good purpose, there are things that happen that nobody planned on. So taking this to, I guess, an extreme, I was a voluntary seminary teacher for 4 years. And in Colorado, we don't have the paid seminary teachers. Or just anywhere in our church where we're fulfilling a calling as a teacher and we're teaching, say, the proclamation on the family. We're talking about mothers, fathers, the family, that, those fighting words that we've talked about. Could we be sued? Because here we've also talked about the disintegration of the family. Say you have kids that are going between two homes and one of them tells a parent who doesn't believe any of what we're teaching, what they're learning about, and that parent decides to, could potentially they sue someone like me or a teacher? I'm just curious. How far can we take that?
And that's a great question. And frankly, one of the criticisms about something like the Equality Act that I've read and thought about is it creates so many ambiguous situations. The notion of saying you can't discriminate in all of these areas on this basis creates a scenario where there's a lot of lawsuits. Because how far is a seminary class a public accommodation? Well, if it's open to the public, if anybody can attend, maybe it is in certain contexts. And so maybe it does create a basis for a lawsuit. I will tell you, too, if you look at other countries that who don't have the First Amendment, we fortunately still have a First Amendment. So how these would intersect is really going to be probably another place where there'll be lots of litigation. Yeah. But there have been places, France, Canada, UK, where a private religious setting, even where somebody taught our law of chastity, was deemed discriminatory towards homosexuals. And under laws like this, people were found to have committed hate crimes or to violated rules of discrimination. And so it does create some concerns in those areas because you mentioned unintended consequences. I do think there are some who have intended consequences. They don't want the Family Proclamation taught, frankly.
Yeah, and that reminds me of one interesting thing about this is it's been put through the House, and there's been several representatives in the House that have put through, I don't know what the legal term is, but they'll put through,
a religious exemption or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. They'll try to add that in, and you can kind of see by whether or not that passes or not what maybe the true intent of the bill is. I think it was Representative McClintock from California. He introduced something specifically in the bill that would say that transgender men, biological men, couldn't compete in women's sports because that was kind of ambiguous in the Equality Act itself, but it was almost unanimously turned down. So I guess if someone really has questions about what they feel are the intended consequences that maybe appear unintended because of the ambiguity of the text, could maybe go look at some of those things and see whether or not, they're saying, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We'll put that through, or no, we don't want that. You know what I mean?
And that's where having these laws sometimes, people, I think I might have even used this phrase the last time we visited, that the law is a teacher. And I do think the intended consequence of pushing these laws is to teach something, not just teach that discrimination for purposes that has nothing to do with the purpose of an act, for instance, employment. If I'm just hiring somebody to serve burgers at McDonald's, their sexual identity or their sexual preferences have no bearing on their ability to serve a burger. But if you want to promote that there are no differences between men and women, that there are no differences between somebody who identifies as a man, even though they're a biological female, then you pass a law like this.
Right.
I find it interesting to find that among the sponsors of these bills is a coalition of employers. Virtually every major employer across the country already has private rules that prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender, sexual orientation, gender identity.
Right. That begs the question then. I mean, do we even need this law with the Constitution and the amendments as they are when we see all the things that have been passed? I mean, is it really even necessary?
Again, my opinion is it's not. But unless, again, that notion of the law as a teacher, you're trying to teach something or prohibit the teaching of something that you don't like. And that's where I think we go back to the warning part in paragraph 8, warning about the disintegration of the family. If we don't have, because the law is a teacher, it just is. We all know that certain things are wrong because they're against the law. They're against God's law, and the civil law happens to square with that.
Right.
Thou shalt not steal. We've all been taught you shouldn't steal as a kid, and it was the rule, and it's been the law. If you pass laws that don't promote the family as the central unit of society, you start seeing things fall apart. And again, we could point to all sorts of things, although unfortunately it's not the most uplifting thing to point about the disintegration of the family and thus the calamities brought upon society. I'd much prefer to talk about it in the more favorable context. So if we focus on helping the family, we'll bring about the blessings that the prophets of old have talked about. And they're blessings that apply on the individual level, the family level, and the societal level. The city of Enoch wouldn't have been the city of Enoch had it not had rules and laws and not allowed the disintegration of the family. So I think that's, again, the purpose for the Family Proclamation website and this podcast. It's to promote good and sound and decent principles that bless the lives of others. Yes, we're trying to forestall the calamities that have been foretold. But in doing so, it's not we just didn't arrive at an equilibrium like, oh, thank goodness we didn't have all those bad things happen. No, what happens is not just nothing. What happens are all sorts of wonderful blessings to individuals, to families, and to the communities and societies that exist.
There's a great quote that actually is in the Family Proclamation website under some of the evidences that support these truths. And this is Patiram Sorokin, the founder, I don't know if I said that right, the founder of sociology at Harvard University. He pointed to the regulation of sexuality as the essential first mark of civilization. According to Sorokin, civilization is possible only when marriage is normative and sexual conduct is censured outside of the marital relationship. Furthermore, Sorokin traced the rise and fall of civilizations and concluded that the weakening of marriage was the first sign of civilizational collapse. I mean,
what does that say about where we are?
Yeah, that's kind of scary.
It is scary because, again, you can look back to some of the developments that happened during the 60s, and they even go back further. But you just look at where we are with marriage and the role that marriage plays. People look on marriage. When we hit 25 years, we took a trip, and people were just shocked that we'd been married for 25 years. And it is a long time. It's a quarter of a century, my kids tell me. We're old. But it didn't used to be that way. It used to be that marriages did last longer, and it was viewed as something that people aspired to. And little girls played dress up, and they played house because mommy and daddy were daddy came home from work and all. I mean, that was part of the function of society. And now it's talked about as something that's a little unique. Oh yeah, marriage, that's an option.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I'm so grateful that you did talk about the great blessings that do come from keeping these things. I think, just like you said earlier, these calamities can come on individuals, also on communities, also on nations. And I think that the reverse is also true, that the blessings, I mean, the country you live in or the community you live in doesn't necessarily have to perfectly subscribe to these ideals in order for you to have an excellent family life. And sure, it may be harder, but I think that those blessings can also come upon the individual, the community, and the nation just as much as the calamities. And so I'm grateful that you kind of brought out that, there is hope. And sometimes, my blood boils when we talk about, a systemic effort to take away our freedoms or something similar to that. And I may not look it, but I can get angry. No one's ever seen it, but I know.
You look a little bit like Bruce Banner, though, so I wouldn't want to.
Yeah, don't see me when I get angry. But I'm grateful you brought that up because there is a lot of hope and there's a lot of things that we can do to make sure that our families are strong.
Well, and sometimes that's the only area right now, as you look at the world, that we can control. I mean, I still go back to one of my favorite quotes is Barbara Bush. She said, it matters not so much what happens in the White House, but what happens in your house. So true. And I think that that's the hopeful message of the Family Proclamation and kind of what we're trying to get out there is that you may not be able to control everything that's happening. And I think we're all feeling a little out of control in today's environment. And you have to look back, what can I do and to improve? And I guess that's kind of one of the points of this whole podcast is to continue to hopefully give people hope. I mean, you do at some point have to talk about the calamities. It's written in here, and the warning. I mean, everybody responds to something differently, right? Some people respond to the really positivity, and other people are like, I don't like that warning. I want to avoid that. So whatever it takes to get people to, I guess, wake up to that reality that strong families are the core of a healthy society.
Well, I have to say, I think among the reasons we have some of what I would view as political difficulties nowadays is because too many families, not just that they've failed, because I know plenty of families that are intact, and yet they maybe haven't bought into a notion that predates President Nelson teaching it, that the church is a home-centered, church-supported organization. Mm-hmm. And so when they're not learning about the basic principles of the gospel at church, as well as if they don't have a good seminary teacher like you were, or good Sunday school teachers and young men's and young women's leaders and primary teachers, if parents aren't taking on those responsibilities at home, then what are they doing when they try to relate what's going on in society to what we're teaching at home? And I think one of the failures of society writ large, a sign of some weakness in the family overall is even strong families. Well, but that's a political thing, or we're not going to talk about that. We're too busy just playing t-ball, which is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. I mean, sports and family activities and music are all wonderful, but we do need to recognize that we function within a society, and among the primary responsibilities parents have, is to teach their children. And that, I think, includes all of the ways in which we, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and faithful Christians, interact with the rest of the world around us. If we're not the leaven for the world, if Christ taught that we're the leaven for what? Not the leaven for the church, but for the whole world, which means we've got to be out there. We've got to be teaching these truths. We've got to be warning against calamities, but promoting these good, great blessings. And again, it starts with the family and recognizing, well, no, we have to have some conversations around the kitchen table that our kids don't want to have. Yeah. That we didn't have when I was a kid because the world's different. But anyway.
Well, thank you for that. That's
10 thumbs up.
We always want to end on a hopeful note.
Yeah. Right? And I just got back from a family vacation, and the timing of recording this was, of course, the supposedly, or I guess they're calling it an insurrection in Washington, and the election in Georgia that gave the Democrats control of both houses of Congress and the presidency. And so very chaotic times. And some of the family was reading online about some of what was going on and getting a little bit exercised and worried. And I just said, guys, look, here we are gathered together as a family. This isn't the end. And frankly, if we think of the long haul, the Lord has never taken away his kingdom again from the earth. And we have prophets and apostles who issue things like the Family Proclamation, not because the calamities that are come will end it all, because at this stage of the game, it won't. Yeah. So we can gather together our family. We can focus on the things that we need to. They say familiarity breeds contempt, and we had our moments on this family trip.
Every family does.
But on the whole, it was just such a wonderful time to be together. And I think if we as families and individuals keep focusing on that and spread that to others, we could be missionaries for the family and for the Family Proclamation, because it is part and parcel of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the best way to learn the principles of forgiveness and faith and repentance and our experiences with your families.
Yeah. Well, and as the darkness increases, the lights will shine brighter and people will be drawn to the light. And the light will be more easily seen as the darkness increases.
I agree wholeheartedly. That's the real positive note, that even, again, the calamities are not the end.
Yeah. And that is as good of an ending note as I've ever
Absolutely.
heard. We are so grateful, Brent, for you coming again and being with us on this podcast. As always, I am feeling uplifted, so that means that everybody listening to this will probably feel that as well, because I'm pretty average, just like everybody. So people have the same. But we really are grateful. So thanks for taking time to be with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Raising Family podcast. This episode was produced by Carol Rice. Our research coordinator is Angela Valentine. Audio was edited and mixed by John Wright. The Raising Family podcast is brought to you by thefamilyproclamation.org.